Hi. So I first wanted to thank you for watching my last video, which you can find right up here. So today I want to talk about different areas of Japan and the differences between living in them, such as the differences between living in the city in Japan, living in the suburbs, and living in the country. Now, depending on which area of Japan you are living in, there's going to be a lot of differences, and you're probably going to have a pretty vastly different experience. So, today I want to explain some of the pros and cons of each place since I've basically lived, at least for the short term, in all three of these different environments in Japan. So, today I want to explain what it's like to live in each of these environments. So, maybe you can choose which one you like the best. Okay, let's get started. So, first, I'm going to talk about living in the big city in Japan. Now, there are many big cities in Japan, such as Tokyo, Osaka, Fukuoka, Sapporo, etc. And I have experience living in Tokyo for 2 years. And as I said in my first video, I didn't like everything about it, but I think there are also a lot of pros of living in the big city in Japan. So, some of the pros of living in the big city in Japan is that you'll have access to pretty much everything you need, like any type of cultural food, you'll probably be able to find at least one restaurant that serves it. And on top of that, you're going to have a lot of job opportunities, even for jobs where you're going to primarily use English. So I think that's another good thing about living in the big city. And another thing about living in the big city in Japan is that the public transportation is going to be great. You'll have pretty much no reason to own a car. Or even a bicycle if you don't want one. The trains, they come on time, they come frequently. So that's not going to be a problem. And I think there's also a lot of access in big cities to different cultural events, both Japanese and foreign, that you can't find in other places. There's going to be a lot of festivals, though there will be festivals really anywhere, but especially in big cities. And you're going to find like also foreign festivals such as like Latin festivals or something, or like Vietnamese festivals. I went to a Taiwan festival recently in Tokyo, so it really is a good place if you really want access to a lot of events. Now, some of the cons of living in a big city I actually touched upon in my first video, which I'll link right up here. And that is those cons are basically why I decided to leave Tokyo eventually. So, one of the big cons of living in a big city in Japan is that it's just too crowded. Like even in like a quiet suburban area, there's going to be a lot of people, even if it's not particularly noisy. You're still going to be, coming across a lot of people on the day to day, bumping into a lot of people potentially, and at least in Tokyo, I can't speak for Osaka because they have a different reputation, but at least in Tokyo, even though you're coming into contact with a lot of people every day, like that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be friendly to you. In fact, in like the center of Tokyo, people pretty much try to ignore you at all costs. And I got really sick of that, and that is why I actually moved to Kanagawa, and even not so far outside of Tokyo at all. Um, there's fewer people, but these people, they're maybe not the friendliest people I've ever met, but at least they say hi to me sometimes. They nod at me. They, smile at me. And it's like such a big difference, honestly. Also, another problem of living in any big city in Japan is that things are going to be more expensive there than in the suburbs or the countryside. And of course, it's not like things are going to be outrageously expensive. I think Japan as a whole is a very reasonable country to live in. If you don't want to do anything fancy, you're going to be able to live pretty comfortably on a pretty low salary. So I think that's good. Of course, there are exceptions, but generally, I think it's good. Um, but in any big city, like especially Tokyo, but really anywhere like Tokyo, Osaka, Sapporo, Fukuoka, etc., things will be a little more expensive than they are in the suburbs or in the countryside. So just expect that. And again, it's not outrageous, but there's definitely a difference. Also, another problem of living in a big city in Japan is that there's not much like nature. Um, Osaka's especially bad. That's part of why I probably wouldn't want to live in the center of Osaka, because it's even worse than Tokyo. Like, it's like basically like there's no, I'm not going to say there's no parks, but it just feels a lot more concrete and gray and like dismal than even Tokyo does. I remember when I was living in Osaka, or no, it wasn't when I was living in Osaka, whatever. I was down there, right? I was down there and I went up to the Abeno Harukas building. I think that's what it's called, which is like the tallest building, I believe, in Japan, if not only in Osaka. And I looked out and I could see all of Osaka from the top floor. And what I noticed was that the entire city was pretty much gray. Like, there was almost no green space. Like, I thought I was looking out onto this like cyberpunk wasteland. And that is what really cemented to me that I really don't want to live in Osaka, even though I wasn't really considering it. I'm like, yeah, I'm definitely not going to live there now. I think Osaka is a good place to like go for a few days and have a good time, see the sights, do some partying, whatever. But living in the city, I'm not sure about that. Now, Osaka Prefecture as a whole, which Osaka isn't just a city, this is a total tangent, whatever, about Osaka, but in the prefecture itself, I think there's a lot of more opportunity to have more green space and a more peaceful location. But anyway, okay, I'm off track. So, even in Tokyo, though, which is better than Osaka because it has a lot of parks and a lot of trees and stuff, the thing about the nature in Tokyo is that it's still like cultivated, it's still man made. It's not like the fully wild natural landscape that you might want if you want to experience nature in Japan. So if you want to experience something that's more, what's the word? Rugged, not even rugged, but just like naturally beautiful and not manicured, then Tokyo, even Tokyo or any big city, is not the place to do that. I would either live in a rural location or live in the suburbs where you have more access to more rugged nature pretty close by. Okay, so the next area of Japan that I'm going to talk about is the suburbs. And I actually think the suburbs are kind of a hidden gem in Japan. I know in America, which is the only country I really have experience living in, the only other country, the suburbs get a bad rap, and I understand why, because it's a bunch of like single family McMansions, right? With everyone drives an SUV. That's the stereotype, and it's like half true. Um, and it's bad for the environment, and everyone's like, super separated from each other, and like, and you can't really afford to buy a house there unless you have like, you're like dual income and you both make pretty good incomes. And like, if you don't have a family and you live in the suburbs, people look at you weird. Like, that's the stereotype, right? But I feel like in my experience, the suburbs in Japan are a little different. Now, in an American suburb, it'd be pretty hard for you to find like an apartment building. Like, it's mostly going to be single family homes. Um, but in Japan, it's actually a lot different. So the suburbs in Japan, I basically live in a suburb, is kind of a mix of single family houses and apartment buildings, which makes it a lot more accessible for single people such as myself, right, to live in the suburbs and exist there comfortably and not have to be paying way too much for like a house that they're renting or something, or have to buy a house. Like, you can very easily rent a home in the Japanese suburbs as well. And also, I think another good point of the Japanese suburbs is that, again, if you're a single person and you don't have a family, nobody really looks at you weird. Like, where I live is pretty much a mix of families and single people, so it's really normal here. And another good thing about the Japanese suburbs is that, unlike American suburbs where you pretty much need a car to get anywhere, in Japanese suburbs, usually there's still pretty good access to public transportation. So, in my case, even though my station is farther away from me than it was back when I lived in Tokyo, it's still not a bad walk at all. It's not going to be like half an hour or anything, or even 20 minutes. It's going to be manageable, right? And because of that, a lot of suburbs in Japan have really easy access to the bigger cities. So you can go do those activities you want to do, like cultural activities, or even getting a job in the city and just commuting from the suburbs. You can do that very easily living in a suburb in Japan. So it's more like if you want a slightly quieter living situation and you still want access to a city, it's really convenient. And also, lastly, in the Japanese suburbs, it there's definitely more opportunities to experience nature, right? I wouldn't say the suburbs are these like beautiful, lush, green, landscapes or anything, like somewhere in Shirakawa-go or something, but they are like not in the city center, which means like if you travel on the train for like 30 minutes or an hour, um, it'll be pretty easy to get somewhere with really beautiful nature. And it won't be as far as in the city where it might take like an hour and a half to get out there, So it's good. It's closer. Like I said, I actually live close to a forest, which I'm really happy about. But then again, I'm not trying to say that everywhere in the suburbs of Japan you'll find a forest, because you probably won't. Okay, and lastly, I'm going to talk about living in the countryside in Japan. Now, in the countryside, I have less experience living than in the suburbs or the city, except for one summer when I worked at a summer camp in Japan in the countryside of Japan. So, and I only did that for about 6 weeks, so it wasn't necessarily the real experience. And I wasn't actually living on my own, I was living at the camp. So, again, it wasn't like if you're actually living and working in the country, right? But anyway, I have lived there briefly. And so, of course, the biggest draw of the Japanese countryside is its beauty. It's incredibly beautiful. It's like what, Studio Ghibli bases its movies off of, etc. It's what a lot of people on like Instagram like to romanticize, right? And take a bunch of beautiful pictures of the Japanese countryside. It's maybe one of the only perks of also being an ALT in the Japanese countryside is you're going to live in a beautiful location. You might feel isolated. In fact, if you don't speak any Japanese, you definitely will, but at least you'll be isolated in a place that is beautiful, you know? And so, yeah, the countryside is beautiful. I guess a pro of the countryside, depending on how you think of it, is it's not crowded. So you won't be bumping into people every which way, which can also be a con because, of course, loneliness is a thing. And again, even if you do speak Japanese, you could still be lonely in the countryside because there's just so few people to get to know that you might not run into someone or meet someone who you really vibe with just because there's a lower density of people to choose from, right? But that being said, I know that people in the Japanese countryside are very known for being friendly, definitely compared to the cities they are. So while you're not going to be around a lot of people, people will probably be more outgoing, and if you try to talk to them, they won't think of it as weird. They might want to talk to you, practice English, or speak in Japanese if you can speak Japanese. So, yeah. I'm looking at my notes. Hold on. So, another con of the countryside is that you're probably going to need a car. Like, if you're really out in the boonies, like, there probably won't be a train station for like 20 or 30 minutes walk. Now, if you're okay walking 20 minutes, that's kind of on the border for me because I do a lot of walking. I probably wouldn't want to do that. If you're okay walking like 20 minutes, maybe you could find an apartment in the countryside. And that's the other thing. There actually are apartment buildings even in the countryside. Like there's apartment buildings everywhere in Japan, even though in, let's say, America, you wouldn't really find apartment buildings in the countryside, right? So, but yeah, like sometimes you're going to be living like 30 minutes away on foot from a train station, so it's a lot better to have a car in the countryside. And another con of the countryside is that there's job applications, fewer job opportunities, especially for someone who is not fluent in Japanese or speaks only English. And even as an English teacher, there's probably not going to be that many job opportunities in the countryside. Like if you, let's say, go to the countryside as an ALT, which is an assistant language teacher, if I didn't explain that earlier, if you don't like your ALT position for whatever reason, it's not guaranteed that you'll find something in the same town you're already living in so that you can stay in that town. You might have to move to another town in the countryside somewhere else, or into the city to find a job, because just the frequency of jobs, even English schools out there, is not that much. And this is kind of a pro if you're into this, which is like renovating an akiya, which is an akiya is an abandoned Japanese house, basically. And I'm sure you've probably heard, if you're on the beat, so to speak, of Japanese culture and current events, I'm sure you've heard of the Akiya craze and of how many Akiya are being given away for like very cheaply, between let's say 20,000 US dollars and like literally $0. Akiya are being given away, mostly because there's a lot of old people who, let's say, owned this house their entire life and then died, and then their family doesn't necessarily want to take care of the house, or just because there's families who lived in the house and they're moving to the city for better work opportunities, so they're selling their house in the country. So that's really why Akiya have sprung up in the past, like, say, 5 to 10 years. And I think if you are really invested in living in the Japanese countryside and you have a way to like make money while living out there, let's say you work remotely, right? Um, and you want the challenge of buying a cheap abandoned Japanese house and renovating it, then I think there's a lot of opportunities to do that in the countryside, again, which could be a pro if you are into renovating an old house, which I don't think I'd necessarily be into. And again, also Akiya, they do often have a requirement from the government that if you buy it, you are going to have to renovate it within the span of like 10 years. And they're going to actually check with you to make sure you're progressing on that. And or I don't know what the penalty is if you don't do it, but I know it's a requirement that you have to do it in many cases, not all cases, but in many. And if you don't, something not ideal will happen. So just keep that in mind if you're thinking of buying an Akiya as well. And also, obviously, that the house might have a lot of problems because it's been neglected, and that sometimes the house itself is, let's say the house is $5 US, but the land, and it's advertised as $5 US, but the land itself, which you also have to buy, is let's $5,000 or more, which I think I've heard of happening. Don't quote me on this, but I've heard of like the land price not really being advertised. In any case, if you are into this is an Akiya tangent, isn't it? Yeah. If you're into this idea, definitely do your research. So that is my exhaustive list of the pros and cons of the countryside versus the city versus the suburbs in Japan. And now that I've lived in all three, what would be my favorite? As of present, I would say it's the suburbs because I live in the suburbs and I really like it. But I do want to live in the countryside sometime in the future. Maybe I will buy an Akiya, who knows? Maybe not. And so I definitely want to experience Japanese country life more than I already have. And so once I do that, I will get back to you on that. But the one thing I know is it's definitely not the city. The city is not my favorite. At least Tokyo. Maybe I'd like Fukuoka because it seems like a more chill environment. All right, anyway, that's all I have to say. I hope you have a good week, and I'll see you next week, I guess. Bye!